71, 24, 39, 50. Broadcast. Anna's story.
Good evening, fellow truth seeker, sapient being, and scholar of the anomalous. Your old pal, the narrator here, continuing with Season 2 of Voices from the Aether, with another report from the field. As my grandfather would have said, this one's real corker. It really is an interesting story, we think. It was shared by a listener just like you as part of our broader appeal for your submissions of stories involving hauntings that you believe to be legitimate and true, as opposed to favorite creepypastas or folktales. This story, as far as we know, is 100% true from the perspective of the teller, and has been altered only inasmuch as we have changed his name and some details of ethnicity and location. You'll see why in a minute. It was so important to change those details. Before we continue, we would like to thank everyone who has listened to the program so far. We're really excited to tell you that at present, we have more than 3 digits worth of listeners. Yes, that's a comparative drop in the veritable ocean that is podcasting, but to us, it's a huge step, and we're extremely grateful for everything you've done to continue to support us. As always, if you enjoy what you're listening to, we humbly request that you like, subscribe, and share. Now, we know that certain podcast platforms have a requirement that you leave a review if you want to rate the program in any way. And so, we appreciate the effort that some of you have been going to write a few words in support of the program. If you haven't done that, it would sure be swell of you to do so. And now, to return to business. Report from the field number 2. The obvious explanation is not always the right one. Submitted by SM977.
My family is an odd mix. Eastern European Irish dad on one side, Scots Cherokee mother on the other. Y'all might think that we have a lot of treasured family folk tales, ghost stories, and the like, but the truth is that my parents were only really willing to talk about some of these things after I'd married and moved away. So there are stories I've yet to hear, and other stories I've only recently learned. I'd like to share one of them, and if you like it, I may share another. Now, 2 things would be appropriate for you to understand before I begin. First, that this story is true as far as my mother understands it. She tells it the same way every time she tells the story, and I think that has a ring of authenticity to it. It might also help you to know that my mother is the queen of skeptics. She believes in very little that could be considered superstition. And that is despite the fact that her father was Native American and her mother is Scots-Irish. You'd think she'd grow up believing in this kind of thing if reputations and stereotypes proved to be true, but in this case, no sir, she believes in very little of it. Anyhow, I think that adds some authenticity. Second thing I'd like you to know is that my family are wonderful people. They care for everyone, not a bone of prejudice in their body. Good, solid people, but they're very private. Some relatives are very sensitive about these stories and nervous about my sharing them. And as such, I have deliberately altered identities and/or obscured locations, to use the Society's own words, to ensure that this don't get back to them. In other words, the story is absolutely true except for the bits where I change names, relationships, and locations. Y'all got it? Good. Well, let me tell you the tale. We're from a part of the South that was very heavily settled by Scots and Irish Catholics fleeing persecution, and a fallout of the various Jacobite and Irish rebellions. Many folks like to pretend they didn't come here as desperately poor Catholics trying to hide from an oppressive regime. Some have become born-again fundamentalist Christians who would just as soon spit on you as admit their people were Catholic. But I assure you that many of them come from those roots. Many intermarried with the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, and Choctaw, and other woodland peoples. History is very important to people in our part of the United States, and while some people like to hide the things that their ancestors did during certain parts of our American experience, you might say, the truth is that people are always happy to tell you who they are, who their peoples are, who their daddy's people were, who their mother's people were, etc. Now, being Scots Cherokee ain't quite the same thing as the white fella who claims that he's Choctaw because 200 years ago, one of his great, etc. grandparents was a Native American. No, this is a real thing. There's no surprise that the name Macintosh is quite common amongst the Cherokee. And that's similar Celtic surnames and such can be found among many of the eastern woodland tribes. It's just a thing down here. Now, as far as that other bit about certain periods of history we don't like to talk about, I assure you, the reader, and I assume the listener, that my people fought on the right side of history. You won't find a gray uniform among any of my ancestors. And the fact that families know who fought for whom has been a constant source of quarreling and feuding in this part of the country even today. It's a strange place to live, but, as I said, history is very important to people, even if they like to deny some parts of it. Deny it until, well, it becomes a convenient point of argument with their neighbors, if you get my meaning. Anyhow, this means that the entire part of the country, especially those in the poor areas, those of us whose ancestors fought for the Union against things like slavery and oppression, there's a very active culture involving the Fae, the little people of the woods, ghosts, banshees, and the like. One very common thing you'll find amongst most First Nations and Celtic cultures, irrespective of the specific culture or the tradition involved, is the telling of stories about women who were wronged and wrought vengeance on their oppressors, and, unfortunately, paid the ultimate price, continuing to wreak that vengeance even after death. This is, of course, also the unfortunate origin of the notorious murder ballad, but that's another story for another day. First Nations folks from Mexico, for example, have La Llorona, for example. The Irish and the Scots have their various forms of banshee, and the Upper South had lots of stories that involve white ladies, those often nefarious, non-corporeal beings and revenants who prowl the Appalachians and the Smoky Mountains as threats to any poor soul who happens to cross their path. My mother heard many of these stories, and some are actually kind of silly. A few are actually really funny. The majority are disturbing and absolutely terrifying, particularly to children. I suppose that's why my parents never told them to me. At least, not until I was much older and had children of my own. Now, Mama has a large family. I've got several great uncles, and all but one of the youngest of them served in the World Wars. Most of these, and the younger ones, also served in Korea. One of those great uncles was Uncle Robert. Uncle Robert was an interesting person. I'm sorry to say I only met him once. He was certainly a Cherokee man, with the high cheekbones, the medium-toned skin that darkened considerably in the sun, a head of dark brown hair that had, at the time I met him, turned completely silver, though I'm told that, like me, he got his first gray hairs very early in his teen years. Family trait, maybe. I got mine at 16. Apparently he got his at 14. Anyhow, Uncle Robert was a hard man. He was brilliant. He resented the fact that his humble origins made it hard for him to attain a higher education, though one could be forgiven by believing, by his eloquent speech and his vast knowledge of literature and culture, that he'd attained some sort of graduate degree. He was a firefighter before and after the Second World War. During the war, he saw some of the worst fighting as a tanker. During one incident, his tank was brewed up, as they say, in Holland, and he had to be smuggled out by the Dutch resistance. I believe this was during Market Garden. Anyhow, before that he was fighting in North Africa. 2 Bronze Stars. But because Uncle Robert was so quiet about his time in the war and almost certainly suffering from what we now call PTSD, he rarely spoke about it. So rarely that it wasn't until he died that his children learned the entire story of what had earned them those awards. He wasn't an easy man to know. He marched for civil rights and once beat up a white man who verbally degraded a woman of color passing through their modestly sized town. He was kind of notorious in town for doing that for a while, I have to say. On the other hand, he wasn't particularly faithful to his wife, Aunt Phoebe, and tried, not unsuccessfully, to hide a dependency upon drink. Now, Uncle Robbie's work as a firefighter meant he was often called out of town. He had a lot of experience as a veteran firefighter, and amongst other things, he was an authority on fighting fires in remote and inaccessible regions. Some of those were forest fires. Others happened to be dangerous blazes in those parts of the Appalachians that you simply couldn't get to any other way, but by taking long walks on narrow, precarious paths. That's still true of many of those even today. When he was gone with these assignments, which would take days, he'd often spend 2 or 3 days longer drinking himself into a near stupor before sobering up and going home. More than once my great-grandfather, a policeman, would find him in a drunk tank, slap some sense into him, and bring him home to Phoebe. Fortunately, despite the fact that he apparently couldn't keep his pants up to save his life, he was never abusive as far as I know. He was a flawed man, and he had instincts that were both heroic and completely terrible. When Uncle Robert was at his best, he was a loving, kind-hearted man. When he was at his worst, he was emotionally detached and incapable of showing much affection to anyone or anything. Fortunately, Mama was one of his favorites, and she was one of the rare people who'd get a smile out of him on a regular basis. Uncle Robert and Aunt Phebe lived over the mountain from my mother's hometown. On occasion, she'd ride a bicycle or simply walk to Robert and Phoebe's home and spend a few days with them. She enjoyed their company and learned a lot about her native heritage from her uncle. One summer, she was staying a couple weeks with Phoebe. Uncle Robert was called out to fight a fire in Tennessee, and neither of them expected to see him while she was there. But one morning, about halfway into his stay, Uncle Robert showed up, sober but absolutely exhausted and reeking of soot and ash. He immediately entered the parlor, laid on the old sofa, closed his eyes, and went to sleep, without so much as a word to either of them. This was typical for my great-uncle during one of his dark and distant phases. That night, a particularly hot one, required all the doors to be open, and the windows too. My mother was sleeping in the guest room. She was sleeping very soundly when a series of powerful winds began to bang the shutters against the house. I imagine the winds were a huge relief after a long and sweaty evening, but the noise was enough to wake her from a hard-earned sleep. She was parched, she said, and needed a drink. What she'd often do at night was to creep downstairs, careful not to wake her aunt and uncle, fill a glass with water from the sink and a chunk of ice from their old-fashioned icebox. Remember, they didn't have air conditioning in that part of the country in those days, and anything you could do to cool off, they did. So on this particular evening, Phoebe was out cold and Uncle Robbie was still quietly snoozing on the sofa. My mama climbed down the stairs and passed through the parlor on a shortcut to the kitchen, quiet as a church mouse. My mother can be very quiet. My father used to joke that she was a ninja, and sometimes she, to use his northern words, creeped him out. Pretty funny as a little boy hearing that, I have to say. Anyway, let's go back to Mother. She's doing everything she can to get by Phoebe and Robbie, to be as quiet as she can so she don't wake them. After she does this, she steps into the kitchen. Now, it was one of those old-fashioned farmhouse kitchens, with a huge window looking out on the backyard, an area of rolling bluegrass fronted on an area dense in woods and growing in the foothills of the nearby mountains. She reached for a glass, but my mother had always been slightly shorter than average. No offense to you, Mama. And when she discovered that there were none in the lower cupboard, she groaned, had to carefully walk to the table, and then pull a chair over so she could stand on it to reach a glass on the taller shelves. I've seen those shelves, and even at 6 feet tall, I have a hard time reaching to the top, so I get it. Mama grabbed the glass and closed the cupboard and stepped off the chair. The wind was blowing hard now. My mama describes it as something of a frenzy, and it might have been blown into the frenzy by the comings of a strong storm coming over the mountains. Despite the wind howling around the angles and within the nooks and crannies of the old house, it was dry and it didn't smell for a moment of rain. Mama worried it might be a tornado, something like that. But the signs of that were nowhere to be found outside the rushing, howling wind. The normal chorus of crickets and frogs was silent. The lugubrious wind blew on. My mother felt distinctly uncomfortable, but she remembers seeing nothing unusual within the great window as she carried the chair back to its position and approached the icebox, removing a chunk of ice for herself before gingerly closing the wooden door. Now, she approached the sink, turned it on as slowly as possible to prevent the sound of rushing water in the pipes from waking anybody, and she began to fill the glass. This was a luxury compared to many of our relatives, some of whom still had to pump buckets of water out back or use indoor pumps, which weren't much better. Nice for her, but unusual. Satisfied, she lifted the glass to her mouth, began to sip, and then froze in abject terror. You see, beyond her gaze, past the ephemeral security of the thick pane of glass, she beheld something she'd never forget. There, in the darkness of the yard, illuminated by a moon half cloaked by the lugubrious cloud, was a wafting, semi-corporeal figure. It had the narrow build of a smallish woman, a long white dress upon its form, whose sleeves and uneven hem seemed to glow in that said same light. And above the form there was no visible face, none that she could discern. But there was hair, a great mass of black hair blowing wildly in the wind as the body moved in a slow, undulating motion. Was the figure gesturing to my mother? Was it dancing? And was the howl of the wind unusually musical just now? It froze my mother cold. She gripped the glass like a vice, the icicle of it biting into her fingertips. She wanted to scream, she says, to call and to say something, to call to my uncle or my aunt. But as in that stereotypical ghost story everybody hears, Her voice was frozen in her throat, her vocal cords held tightly. She could barely get out a whisper. See, Mama had heard stories of people seeing ghosts and spirits and losing their abilities to speak. Thinking of these and perhaps one too many late-night ghost stories from the people in the old country, she grabbed her glass tighter, so tightly that it slipped from her grasp and shattered into the sink below. She was unharmed and the noise was slight, but it was enough to wake her from her daze. She still couldn't speak, she still couldn't scream, but she turned quickly from the window and tore off into the parlor, where she found herself running smack into the 6-foot-tall form of Uncle Robert. He grasped her by the shoulders and spoke quietly. The good Robert emerging here. Anna, he said, what's gotten into you and my girl? She could not speak. She shook her head in terror, and even in the dim light, so my uncle told her, he could see her skin was pale as a ghost. You're turning into a full-blown Scot there, Anna, he said gently. What is it? What's frightened you? She turned and pointed a jittery hand toward the kitchen. Uncle Robert was galvanized into action. With a soft squeeze of assurance to her shoulder, that old soldier-turned-firefighter marched boldly into that danger, not knowing what the hell it was. His only thought was to calm her, and if necessary, to protect her. She stood in the doorway, unable to move, whilst Great Uncle Robbie walked into the kitchen. Where is it, Anna? He asked quietly. Out. Side, she managed to stutter out. Window. Robert's broad-shouldered, barrel-chested form strode toward the sink and took up a position near the window that blocked some of the incoming light. I don't see anything, Anna. Oh, sweet merciful Lord. He stopped his talking, halted for what to my mother must have seemed like an eternity, and then slowly, ever so slowly, back toward the door. Your great-grandfather's crucifix is in the end-table door. Go quietly now, Anna, and fetch it for me. Look no further into that window. My mother, still terrified but glad to be back in the parlor, where there were no windows, went quickly to the end table and slid open the drawer with trembling hands. Sure enough, beneath a small bolt of cloth, was my great-great-grandfather's crucifix, a wooden and metal thing that almost certainly had been made in Europe. She grasped the old polished wood and for a moment felt at peace, as if she would really, truly be okay. Despite that, even at that young age, she had very little, if any, religious sympathy. It was somewhat of a miracle, she said, that she had any feeling about it at all, especially one of such confidence. She turned and moved as quickly as she could without making more noise, approached where he now stood in the door, staring toward the window. Do you have it, Annie? He asked quietly. She nodded. Yes, Uncle Rob. Do we need your rifle? He shook his head. If that is what it appears to be. His words were calm, protective, but they carried an air of dread seriousness. That rifle won't do any good. Only a priest or a minister or a rabbi, I reckon, could do it. He took the crucifix and clutched it in his hand, pointing it in the general direction of the window. He clutched my mother's hand with his free hand and grasped her close to him. Lord, I'm not good at this, but you know that I believe in you, he said, peering up at the ceiling. You've saved my life more than once, and I hate to ask for such a thing, wicked with sin as I am, but he never finished the words. Something had changed. The wind blew harder for a moment, as if old Boreas or Zephyrus were letting out one last tremendous gasp before they returned to bed. The clouds parted. The moon now showed fully into their little clearing of a backyard, dappling the grass in glistening blue-green. And the mysterious white woman was gone, banished entirely. Instead, something else presented itself. There was now clearly seen the pair of metal poles across which the clothesline had been stretched. And there, hanging on the clotheslines, were two things. A long, not at all ragged-looking nightgown, and not far from that, what had been a diaphanous terror only a few moments ago, there hung an old, reliable mop, the kind with the long wooden handle and the gray-black mop head. Uncle Robbie was the first to laugh. It was slow at first, then it came out shaking, covered with his hand only to prevent Aunt Phoebe from waking. He snickered, snorted, and shook his head. My mother, not seeing the cause of this, thought for a moment, I think, that Uncle Robert had gone completely mad. Perhaps she'd read one too many Lovecraft stories. and then saw what he beheld. The flowing nightgown now settled into its position on the line, no longer animated by the wind and mop, gently slowing its sway. She laughed and laughed hard, burying her head in his side, and suppressed a howl of delight. She remembers it as being one of the best belly laughs of her life. The two of them looked at each other with mock seriousness for a moment. Uncle Robert slowly and gently placed the crucifix into his pocket and stared down at her the whole time. And then they laughed again. Eventually, he helped her clean up the glass, told her not to worry about it, and got himself a Coke before boiling some water for tea. "This'll help you sleep, Anna," he said. And instead of sleeping immediately, she sat there at the kitchen table, illuminated only by the bright, invigorating moonlight, talking the night away with him about all sorts of things. They went to bed late, laughing, and jokingly wondered aloud how they'd ever live it down. The next morning, Aunt Phoebe looked to them over breakfast. "Y'all got to sleep very late last night, didn't you? What on earth were you up to? Were you playing cards and telling ghost stories?" The two looked at each other, the mock seriousness returning, and then they laughed again. "What's so funny? I want to know," she smiled. "Tell me the joke or whatever it is. I could use a good laugh." They told her. Uncle Robert explained that my mother had accidentally broken a glass in the kitchen. "Oh my," my mother remembered her aunt saying, interrupting the story. "Are you all right, Anna? No cuts, I hope?" "None," my mother told her, and they started the story again. My great-aunt's face turned red for a moment, and then she laughed. A merry sound that tinkled in the way of all good Celtic laughs. "My goodness," she said, "what a wee pickle you two found yourselves in." She laughed heartily to herself and stood, taking some of the plates from the table to the sink with some sly comment about how she needed no help, given that Mama had already broken my most favorite glass. Uncle Robert laughed. Aunt Phoebe continued to laugh. My mama, Anna, blushed a bit, but she soon laughed herself. All continued to laugh until Aunt Phoebe looked out the window and stopped her laughing, dead. "Robbie," she said, "come here for a moment, will you? "What is it, my dear?" She pointed towards the window, and in the yard, illuminated by the summer sun, was the clothesline. 2 poles with rope strung between them, occasionally dotted by weathered wooden clothespins. There was nothing on that line. Nothing. "Robert," she said, "what is today?" "It's Tuesday," he said, bewildered at what he saw in the yard. "Robert, my washing day is Wednesday, and the mop is in the cupboard." So what did they see? What did SM-977's mother really encounter? Was it truly just a nightgown and a mop hanging on the clothesline? Was her aunt trying to pull one over on the two of them after they told the story? It required a lot of pre-planning, I'd have to admit. And that makes me wonder, what did they see? Not my place to judge at this point. I'll leave that to you, the readers and listeners, to decide. And I apologize to SM-977 if I performed his accent particularly badly. Anyhow, as SM-977 would say, and apparently now I do too, that'll be it for now. Thank you for listening. Simply remember that the most obvious explanation is not always the correct one. Sometimes the anomalous likes to make its own jokes at our expense. Good night.
21, 35, 71, 2. Broadcast ends.
The proceeding was the Society of Virtuous Pagans broadcast, provided as a public service. The story tonight was provided by SM-977, or perhaps more accurately, his mother. The story is, so far as he knows, a true telling. As such, the contents of this broadcast and all associated media have not been treated with a Nagoya mimetic. Our performers tonight were August Brotherton and Guinevere McGregor. All of us here at Voices from the Aether would like to give a particular thank you to Creative Minds Audio. They have been incredibly helpful to us throughout the entire process, and every good thing you hear in this episode, sound effects, sound, making our voices sound like they are actually professional, can all be piled entirely upon their plate. The audio engineering has been impeccable, and we thank them so very much. The Helios Radio was developed by the versatile Kieran Byrne. As always, our logo was designed by Matsface. We thank you again for listening and supporting. If you have a story of a haunting that you would like to share with us, feel free to send it along to Society of Virtuous Pagans @gmail.com. Do you have another sort of story you'd like to share? A favorite piece of fiction or nonfiction that you would like us to cover? Perhaps you're a writer and you have a story that you would love to hear in podcast form. Well, feel free to send that along to us too. You can do so at societyofvirtuouspagans @gmail.com. And always remember, have faith. We know.